Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will now continue our event with the first session entitled Broadening Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, Prospects and Possibilities. Therefore, I would like to invite our moderator to be on stage, Ms. Cynthia Ng. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Cynthia Ng is a news anchor, senior editor, producer and journalist at Malaysia's leading news channel Astro Awani. Ladies and gentlemen, our prospective speakers are His Excellency Dr. Ng Heng Hen, Minister of Defence Singapore, and His Excellency Secretary Delfin Lornzana, Secretary of National Defence Philippines. And now, I hand over the session to our moderator, Ms. Cynthia Ng. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, welcome to all participants. It's great to have everyone here. Allow me to say that it is an absolute honor to be moderating this discussion in person. Diplomacy has taken on various shapes and forms, hybrid, virtual, over the course of the pandemic. But I think it's safe to say that nothing beats having a conversation face-to-face. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for having me as moderator. I'm going to jump straight in. Our topic of discussion today is broadening security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. An increasing number of extra-regional countries, our dialogue partners, have expressed their interest in forging security cooperation under the banner of ASEAN-led forums such as the ADMM+. How should Southeast Asian nations respond to this growing interest? And I think more crucially is how can these countries outside of our region best contribute towards peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific? It is my pleasure to introduce our two distinguished speakers today. First, we have, on my left here, is His Excellency Dr. Ng Heng Hen, Minister of Defence, Singapore. Just a quick bio about His Excellency. Dr. Ng has served as the Minister of Defence since 2011. He was previously the Minister for Manpower from 2004 to 2008 in Singapore, following which he became the Minister of Education up till 2011. He was also the leader of the House in Parliament from 2011 to 2015. Dr. Ng was conferred France's Legion of Honor in 2017. The Honorable Minister was trained as a cancer surgeon specializing in breast surgery, having obtained his medical degrees from the National University of Singapore and postgraduate training in the US. Welcome back to Malaysia, Honorable Minister. Next, we have Secretary Delfin, His Excellency Secretary Delfin Lornzana, Secretary of National Defense, the Philippines. Secretary Delfin, he took up the top job in June 2016, bringing to the department his wide expertise in national defense and security, special operations, foreign military affairs, public diplomacy, just to name a few. An army man through and through, Secretary Delfin graduated from the Philippine Military Academy in 1973 and served in the Philippine Army for 29 years. Upon retirement from military service, he headed the Veterans Affairs Office at the Philippine Embassy in Washington, D.C., where he played a very important role in lobbying for the passage of two landmark U.S. legislations for the Filipino World War II veterans. The first one is an compensation fund in 2009, which awarded $265 million to surviving World War II Filipino veterans. And the second legislation that he lobbied and succeeded is the conferment of the Congressional Gold Medal to the Filipino veterans in the war in 2016. Secretary Delfin, kumusta ka? Great to have you here. Just allow me to briefly explain the flow of the event today. Each panelist will be allocated 25 minutes to speak. A single bell will ring at the 23rd minute for the panelists to wrap up, and a double bell will ring once 25 minutes is up. We will then take questions from the floor once our speakers have completed their presentation. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite the Honorable Minister, Dr. Ng, to speak. Over to you, sir.
My defense counterpart, Senior Minister of Defense, Dato Hishammuddin Hussein, Philippines Secretary of National Defense, Delfin Lornzana, Behin Haubi, Brunei Minister of Defense, Maldives Minister of Defense, Maria Didi. Let me thank the Malaysian Ministries of Defense and Home Affairs for this warm hospitality and inviting me to speak. I'm very happy to be back in Kuala Lumpur. I miss the people. If truth be told, I miss more the food. It's got very good food, but I'm delighted to be able to meet my old friends who I see from long years of acquaintance, and it's just wonderful to be physically back. And the resumption of the Putrajaya Forum is a clear demonstration of Malaysia's ability to live with an endemic COVID. And here I want to congratulate Dato Sri Hishammuddin, who leads the task force, as well as the MEF for an excellent job in dealing with the COVID pandemic. Our two prime ministers announced that the land border between Malaysia and Singapore will be open tomorrow. For those of you who are not familiar, it's one of the busiest, if not the busiest land border in the world. More than 300,000 land crossings, one way. And that resumption, without quotas, without quarantine, speaks of the confidence that both countries have towards one another. So well done, I think. The last time I was speaking at the Putrajaya Forum was 4 years ago. It would not be an exaggeration to state that since we met then, the world has changed, precipitated by not one, but two epochal events, COVID and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. These singular challenges have stress-tested existing systems, alliances, partnerships, friendships, and revealed gaps and vulnerabilities. We should address these collectively because no one country can do it alone. Other transnational challenges, which my counterpart, Dato Sri Hishammuddin, rightly pointed out, such as terrorism, climate change, and natural disasters, may have receded in focus somewhat as we dealt with these two events, but they can similarly shock our countries in the future. COVID and the Ukraine-Russian conflict have had an impact globally and far beyond the security realm. There are common threats in both that we can draw lessons from to develop or strengthen existing initiatives to make our regions, or ASEAN at least, more resilient. There are quite a few challenges, but I will focus on three. First, supply chain disruptions. With COVID, I think all of us experienced it in our countries. We witnessed what happened when there were national lockdowns that put a brake on the flow of raw materials and finished goods. In Singapore, there was a run on toiletries. I'm sure that's happened in many, many other countries. This led to shortages of essential consumer products and staples, electronic parts such as semiconductors, and even critical medical supplies, such as personal protective equipment. The Ukraine-Russian conflict has also had a similar impact. The price of commodities and fuel have already risen sharply. Russia is the world's top wheat exporter, and combined with Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, accounts for almost 1/3 of the world's wheat exports. Russia also supplies about 40% of Europe's natural gas and about 1/4 of EU's crude oil import. On an aggregate level, ASEAN is a net exporter of agricultural products. We ought to explore mechanisms to pool resources, to build up resilience and minimize disruptions in our region during times of crises. ASEAN has already committed in the joint statement by Ministers of Agriculture and Forestry in 2020 to ensure food security, food safety and nutrition in the region amidst COVID. And also through the COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund, which helps member states procure the medical supplies and equipment needed to combat the pandemic. ASEAN is also working to extend tariff exemptions for a list of essential goods and even to expand it to include staple food items and vaccine-related products. These are good initiatives, but we need to do more. The second challenge we face is geopolitical rivalry and alliances. In a perfect world, our fight against COVID, which is a public health challenge, should have been a common one, regardless of political ideology or affiliation, developed or emerging economies. All of us know we do not live in a perfect world. But even so, multilateral institutions face difficulties to forge coordinated action in a polarized world. Even the distribution and choice of vaccines could be politicized and resulted in stark differences in vaccine choice, distribution and acceptance, medical care, sufficiency of oxygen, and medical products. The ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict put at risk discussions on climate change-related efforts, such as carbon emission reductions and development of green enterprises and financing, efforts related to cybersecurity, building digital economies, and enhancing digital norms. All these will be difficult to put on the global agenda when rivalries are sharpened. The third challenge is the resumption or aggravation of existing threats. I refer to terrorism and cyber attacks. Again, something that my colleague, I call him my brother, Dato Hishammuddin, spoke about. In spite of COVID restrictions, terrorist groups are still active in organizing, instigating, and conducting attacks, including in our region. Global terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda have proven resilient and adaptable. They have kept their recruitment and radicalization strategies current and are exploiting cyberspace to great effect. With the removal of COVID restrictions on travel, we can expect an increase in terrorist activity. For threats from the cyber domain, both COVID and the Ukraine-Russian conflict also show the impact of disinformation on our people. With COVID, conspiracies and anti-vaccine movements cause undue panic, divided people and their governments, and undermine global public health efforts. Critical infrastructure can be affected through the digital domain. Last May, a ransomware attack on a major American oil pipeline system, Colonial Pipeline, jammed the flow of products in the US East Coast. In October, there was a cyber attack on Iran's fuel system. More recently, cyber attacks affected all shipments from terminals in Belgium and Germany. These examples, or these incidents, are clear examples of the false divide between the virtual and physical worlds. Both state and non-state actors would have recognized the power of the digital domain, and threats emanating from that domain can only increase. ASEAN can address these challenges collectively, based on international principles that individual countries can agree on. Let me cite again 3 areas. First, we must uphold the primacy of a country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Where there are disputes, we must reject forced aggression by any country and instead pursue the settlement of dispute by peaceful means. Here we have good examples, including here meeting in ASEAN, we have good examples, including during the disputes between Malaysia and Indonesia over Sipadan and Likidan, between Malaysia and Singapore on Pedra Branca, Middle Rocks and South Ledge, as well as the land reclamation by Singapore in and around the Straits of Johor. These disputes were settled peacefully based on well-accepted international law or practices. Second, while each country must be able to make decisions based on its own interests, there are shared mechanisms to address transnational challenges, to engage in confidence-building measures to de-escalate tensions and mitigate adverse consequences. Again, we have positive examples of collaborations in our region. Malaysia and Singapore are part of the Malacca Straits Patrol that commenced operations in 2004. Malaysia is also part of the Trilateral Cooperative Agreement in the Sulu-Celebes Seas, established in 2017 to address threats like terrorism and piracy. We have confidence-building initiatives, such as the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which all 18 ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus navies have practiced, and guidelines for air military encounters. We ought to use similar cooperative frameworks to tackle transnational challenges, including supply chain disruptions for essential commodities and energy. Third, in the security sector, we must step up dialogue and collaboration, build confidence and increase understanding through established platforms. The ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting and the Plus, comprising 18 nations that make up close to 90% of the world's military forces, is now the de facto security arrangement of Asia. We also have the five-power defence arrangements between Australia, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, and the United Kingdom. We collaborate through initiatives, including the ADMM Cyber Security and Information Centre of Excellence, the ASEAN Cyber Defence Network, and the Counter-Terrorism Information Facility. These multilateral platforms facilitate information sharing, strengthen trust between militaries, and enhance cooperation for our region to achieve our common goals and mitigate common threats. By strengthening resilience and response within ASEAN and by ASEAN to these challenges, we give greater credibility to ASEAN centrality. Two epochal events have changed our world since we last met. Vulnerabilities and deficiencies have been exposed, and we must take collective action to address them in order to ensure that peace, stability, and progress continue in our region and beyond. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. A lot to unpack, which we will do in a little bit. I would like to remind the participants that we will be having a Q&A session after the presentations. For that, I'd like to invite now His Excellency Delfin Lornzana, Secretary of National Defense Philippines, for his presentation. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am honored to personally join this year's Putrajaya Forum and speak on the broadening security cooperation in the Asia Pacific. I would like to thank Senior Minister of Defense, Dato Seri Hishammuddin Tun Hussein, and the Malaysian Institute of Defense and Security for the invitation and the excellent accommodation. In this talk, I shall zero in on security cooperation in Southeast Asia. Specifically, I will discuss how cooperation led by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, through the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, or ADMM, has been broadened by the to accommodate extra-regional parties through the ADMM Plus. In 2017, during the Philippines ADMM chairmanship, several initiatives were adopted in response to ASEAN's increasing security engagement. As a preface, let me emphasize that over the last decades, the ASEAN has successfully established its identity as an indispensable organization in the Asia-Pacific region, not only politically and economically, but most especially in the area of regional security. The ASEAN has been a leading platform that promotes regional security cooperation that are inclusive of rising and status quo of powers as well as small and large states. Veering away from more exclusive and major power centers, it operates on a multilateral process built on consensus and pragmatism. Guided by the principles of respect for sovereignty, non-interference on domestic issues, and non-use of force, the ASEAN has developed a conducive atmosphere that welcomes diverse perceptions and outlooks. As a result, it has fostered an expanding network of security ties and activities, subsuming otherwise exclusive security practices under shared frameworks. It is no surprise then, therefore, that dialogue partners and extra-regional partners have expressed increasing interest in forging security cooperation with the ASEAN. In engaging with the dialogue partners and extra-regional parties, member states assert ASEAN centrality while remaining receptive to other ideas and opinions. As earlier mentioned, the ASEAN defense ministers adopted a concept paper during the Philippines chairmanship in 2017, annualizing the ADMM Plus meetings, which used to be held every 2 years. This shift aims to provide a frequent and sustainable dialogues for all 8 plus countries, namely Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States. There are 3 more countries who are applying to get in. This was in response to the persistent requests of plus countries for separate meetings with the ASEAN defense ministers. We also agreed that special meetings with individual plus countries may only be convened when called upon by the ADMM. Additionally, we adopted the second protocol defining the participation of non-plus countries as observers in the activities of the 7 experts working groups of the ADMM Plus, covering areas such as counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, maritime security, military medicine, peacekeeping operations, humanitarian mine actions, and cybersecurity. However, plus countries continue to request for separate meetings and more exclusive interactions with the members. Thus, in 2021, the ADMM adopted guidelines on evaluating requests for informal ADMM plus 1 meetings under the concept paper on the ADMM's external engagements, which provides that it is solely within the discretion and prerogative of the ADMM members to consider such meetings. Affirming the ADMM's commitment to the implementation of the ADMM Plus observership program, the same concept paper also provides that it is within the ADMM's prerogative to approve the applications of non-plus countries. Procedural matters aside, the ADMM has always maintained that interactions with dialogue partners and extra-regional parties should be aligned with the ideals of the ASEAN Political Security Community Blueprint 2025. As such, ASEAN-led mechanisms must always remain ASEAN-centric in accordance with the ASEAN Charter on the guidelines for ASEAN's external relations. Ultimately, the effectiveness of the ASEAN security engagement with external parties depends upon the extent to which ASEAN norms and values have been understood and internalized. So how can extra-regional parties best contribute to Asia-Pacific peace and security? Simply by manifesting their commitment to the very principles that enable the 10 highly diverse states to manage their differences and lay the groundworks for dialogue and cooperation. This has even extended to other key players. Extra-regional parties should engage the ASEAN with good faith and respect for the region's interests and right to self-determination. They should support ASEAN-led security mechanisms and initiatives rather than seeking ASEAN member states to choose among strategic alternatives amid geopolitical competition or pressuring ASEAN to work against its core principles. Certainly, the ASEAN has established itself as an important regional bloc, which is attracting the interest of other countries, including the major powers. However, its principles and mechanisms are still far from perfect, eliciting comments that the ASEAN way is lenient and too accommodating. These, excuse me. These perceived by critics ASEAN's reception of highly diverse perspectives sometimes hinder it from being more proactive and firm in more complex traditional security concerns. Too much flexibility prevents it from building consensus, leading to doubt if ASEAN will ever be capable of standing strongly for the interest of the member states. On the flip side, it is being argued that ASEAN's voluntary and loosely structured nature of security cooperation allows it to navigate the whole spectrum of institutional struggle, confrontation, negotiation, bargaining, compromise, and balance between and among its member states and external parties. Moreover, while the ASEAN exists for the interest of its member states, the region cannot isolate itself from the larger international community. Either way, the ASEAN should learn from experience and be more proactive. It must leverage its broadening security cooperation with extra-regional parties. As for the ADMM and ADMM+, these are relatively young security fora with much to learn from the experiences of other regional security platforms. This is especially true in building consensus among member states and dialogue partners. For instance, the ADMM and ADMM Plus may learn from the consensus-based decision-making practiced by the members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, while retaining the peculiarities of the Asia-Pacific region. In conclusion, let me underscore that in an environment where there is growing tribalism and uncertainty and unfamiliarity induces fear and skepticism, ASEAN's embrace of external partners is indispensable. ASEAN's success is important not only to its member states, but also to the bigger international community. With its growing links of security ties, it can send a strong message to the world that diverse coexistence is not an impediment to successful relationship. At the core of this is the ASEAN centrality, a feature that rests on our trust and confidence in each other, as well as on our partners. Thank you for listening. Mabuhay.
Thank you, Secretary Delfin. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would now like to move on to the exciting part of the session, which is the Q&A. The mics are in front of you, so please tell us your name, tell us where you're from, and tell us who do you want your question to be answered. Right. If I may sum up the presentation earlier by both Minister and Secretary Delfin, is that they both highlighted the common interests and challenges that we share in the region. But security reality is that Asia-Pacific is increasingly becoming the main stage of rivalry between major powers. If I may start to get the ball rolling, I'd like to pose these questions to our ministers. Does ASEAN still have effective tools to provide a stabilizing force to preserve the status quo that Sri Hisham mentioned, balance earlier? If you can just give us an understanding about the political shifts or alignments that have been happening in the past 2 years, and what has changed, and what concerns you the most? Open to all ministers.
You guys want to answer first? There's no real shift, but what you see on stage today, the three of us, is the strength that we have. The joint future, the sincerity, and the openness of looking at the future together is something that is pretty unique in ASEAN. Even our speeches today, we didn't share notes, but we're all on the same page when it comes to how important the existing structures that we have is utilized at its fullest. Now, the key dealing with structures is already tough, but the key is to fill those structures with people who are able to actually navigate forward using the structures that exist. We talked about ADMM, we talked about ADMM Plus. We spoke about Ukraine, we spoke about the geopolitics of the superpowers, but at the end of the day, we, the 10 nations of ASEAN, will have to chart our own destiny in our region. And how do we do that if we do not get our house in order first? So don't sell ourselves short. Our message to anybody who's eyeing the region, and both my colleagues, Dr. Ng and Secretary Delfin, mentioned the interest of powers and members trying to come within the structures that exist. There must be a reason why. Why are they interested? And exactly what we have inherited from our forefathers. Our job today is to keep those structures in place so that we can then pass it on to other generations of leaders from Singapore, Philippines, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, because that structure seemed to have worked in the past. Dr. Ng mentioned cases which in other parts of the world probably will end up with wars between nations. How we dealt with on sensitive issues, Malaysia and Singapore, how we're going to navigate South China Sea. Just to end, to be very candid, if we only just deal with the Sabah issue with Philippines, nothing will move. President Duterte said the Sabah issues will be there till the end of time, probably. Definitely beyond our lifetime. But that didn't stop me, Delfin, and Bapak Prabowo to deal with the trilateral arrangements with regards to a common foe that we are facing in the Sulawesi and the Sulu Seas. So it's just a matter of whether it's a question of leadership, it's a question of trust, it's a question of courage, because the structures are already there. It's only up to the leaders to make sure that we use these structures to move forward and not dwell with things that will divide.
Thank you, Dr. Sri. Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's an interesting question. Does ASEAN have the ability to be a stabilizing force amid geopolitical rivalry? And my brother, Hishammuddin, has given an eloquent reply, and in the main, I agree with him. But let me also answer in an equivocal way. At face value, the answer is no. Why? If you look at economic heft, combined ASEAN GDP, about that of India, 2 over US trillion. It's about a seventh of China's, 14 trillion, about 1/10 of United States, 20 trillion. So based on economic heft, the answer would be no. Militarily, ASEAN military spending combined does not amount to the smallest or the least spent by any of the +8 countries. So militarily, no. So is it strategic overreach to think that ASEAN can be a stabilizing force? I have an interesting parallel, and you may not subscribe to it, but those of you who follow the Lord of the Rings, ASEAN is like the Hobbit. Nobody trusted the other person with greater power to carry that ring, the ring that binds us all. And they gave it to the hobbits. ASEAN's position and strengths are vicariously obtained. We don't acquire it by dint of military power or economic heft. And I think that position is a vaunted one, but also a precious one, and it can be also vicariously given. It can also be forcefully taken away. And I think the environment got very much more difficult with the Ukraine-Russian conflict because the strategic rivalries were sharpened. Even before that, it was amounted to 5G networks, who you chose. It will now lead to, if sanctions are applied beyond Russia, it will apply to who you buy from, who you sell to, who you bank with, who you procure your supply chains from, your military equipment, and so on and so forth. What they call a bifurcated world. Some have gone to the extent of saying this is the end of globalization. So it's an equivocal answer.
Thank you, Minister. Secretary Delfin.
Yes, I think the ASEAN is a stabilizing force in the region. It's composed of 10 diverse countries. Of course, there are countries that have common, ancestors like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, from the Malay race. And some of the problems that confronts the region does not circumscribe the totality of the relationships among members. But I still believe that if these 10 countries can forge together a closer relationship, respecting its rights to be independent, not interfering in the domestic affairs of one country, I think we are stronger. And as Dr. Ng has said a while ago, our GDP is 7th of China and 1/10 of the US. That's a huge trade. And we are one of the most dynamic region in the world now. The growth of the economy in the region is spectacular. Despite the pandemic, I think the Philippines will grow about 6% this year, although it was 3% last year, and the year before that, it was almost zero because of the pandemic. But we are bouncing back, and so does the other countries here in the region. And here, you can see other countries trying to see what is these 10 countries doing right. They manage their differences very well, like what Minister Hishammuddin a while ago said, that if we only focus on the Sabah issue, then we will never agree with each other. In like manner, the South China Sea dispute with China and some other countries, does not circumscribe the relationship between among countries. We have trade with China, we have people-to-people relations with China, and we manage this properly. It's a very tricky road to navigate, but we are doing it. I think we are talking, and as they said, if people are talking, they are not shooting. So that's what we are doing here. So we are a stabilizing force here in the region.
All three of you. Right. I believe we have questions from the floor. Can we get the first one? The gentleman over there. Okay, I may have been mistaken. Is that the queue for the questions over there? Oh, we have one over here. Yes, please.
Thank you, Minister. I'm Lieutenant Zaham, Malaysian Army, Malaysian Armed Forces Defense College. I have a question. ASEAN has always received support from regional neighbors, partners when we face challenges such as natural disasters, pandemic, and terrorism issues. Will the reluctance of ASEAN to condemn the countries involved in the ongoing conflict in Eastern Europe jeopardize the support and benefits from our neighbors and partners when we face issues and challenges in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the question here is about ASEAN's centrality and stance on the issue. I think we have heard some divergent views from respective countries. Who would like to take that question? Secretary Delfin.
We supported the UN resolution condemning the attack of Russia against Ukraine. We deplore our country deplore those civilians being killed, civilians evacuating their homes and moving in droves to other countries. We deplore those things. We support the UN resolution condemning Russia. And my president said that it is not the way countries resolve their differences. And we hope that they could resolve their differences soon, because it is affecting everybody, including my country.
We too supported the UN resolution. But at the same time, it is important to realize that we have to decide what is best for our region. We have in the past been caught up between the geopolitics of the superpowers, and we have managed to navigate them in many ways. But as Dr. Ng said just now, the Ukraine dynamics seems to be a bit more forceful than the past. And we all have to individually and within the 10 countries decide what we should do. I personally feel that hypocrisy and double standards in isolated incidents around the world in the past shows to us that at the end of the day, temporary friction between the superpowers should not force us in ASEAN to decide one way or the other. One. Secondly, don't underestimate what we have in ASEAN. Yes, as far economically, we will not be able to compete with these huge economies out there. Yes, militarily, combined military might of Philippines, Singapore, and Malaysia will not be able to even touch a fraction of what the superpowers have. But what we do have is that these superpowers cannot see and cannot afford to see instability in our region. That is why it's important to make sure that the Malacca Straits is stable and safe, because it's the most congested waterway. Dato Ng talked about the breakdown in supply chains just because of COVID. That is COVID. Supplies from China to other parts of the world has got to go through our region. If there is instability from within our 10 nations, it will affect the superpowers. And there are problems that they face. We will have to think long and hard how that impacts on us individually with the nations of ASEAN and collectively as 10 countries of ASEAN. We look into the past, look at what happened in Libya, look what happened to Afghanistan, look what happened to Iraq. How is that different from what is unfolding right now in the Ukraine? That is for the forum to advise the ministers later today.
Thank you, Dato Sri. Minister, I think Singapore by far was the one that has taken the strongest, quickest stance to condemn the Russian-Ukraine crisis. Talk to us about the thoughts behind it, and it is quite a departure from a more neutral stance that ASEAN countries are known to make.
I don't think this is an issue of neutrality, first of all. It was a simple question posed by, I think, the officer from the MAF, but it's actually a very tricky question. So let's deal with it. If you ask all countries whether they believe that their sovereignty and territorial integrity must be preserved, I think all countries would say yes. It's a basic principle of countries since the Treaty of Westphalia, right? Now nearly 200 years. That's the basis in which we wake up every day and say that, well, my country can decide on its own and others shouldn't invade me. I mean, that's the starting point. Nobody would disagree with that. So that's on principle, and so it's not an issue of neutrality. Then I think the reality, as my learned colleagues and brother have said, that, well, the world isn't so definitive. Sometimes you know on principle it's wrong, but you choose not to say anything. It happens in our family situations, right? People quarrel, and you know, well, this is Abang, this is Adik, and Adik is actually right in this instance, but since Abang, you know, and Abang and I have a history, maybe I keep quiet and try to deal with it in a different way. That's politics, that's diplomacy, that's foreign relations. That's the reality. Why did Singapore choose to assert on just point of principle? Because I think maybe we're more sensitive because we are a small country, 700 square kilometers, and on principle, we think that that principle ought to be articulated. And even for sanctions, it applied to things which Russia could use as to continue war. But that argument now has extended globally, and I'll just end there. It's an important point, which is why I said it would be a much harder environment going forward. The argument is this. Previously, it was great. All of us prosper under globalization. Economies commonly prosper. I help you, you help me. Just like US sponsored China into WTO ascension in the 1980s under the Clinton administration for joint prosperity. Russia too, common finance systems, and so on and so forth. But the argument is turned. You are using the wealth that I help you accumulate to one day attack me. And whether it's money, whether it's chips, whether it's advanced technology, and therefore the argument that this is the end to globalization. And somebody put it as stark as this: if Europe continues to pay Russia for energy, they are enabling Russia. I think that you will need both, and we have nothing against Russia. As my colleagues will tell you, we meet at Shangri-La Dialogue. I've met Sergei Shoigu personally. I've gone to Moscow when he invited me for his Moscow forum, and we had a good talk over issues. But on point of principle, Singapore voiced that it was wrong for a country that based on territorial integrity and sovereignty that ought to be preserved. And I think all of us can agree on that. We still hope for diplomatic initiatives, for some kind of diplomatic solution, because the suffering is horrendous, and none of us want that.
Thank you so much, Minister, for responding to that. Do we have more questions from the floor? Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon, Excellency Minister. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Abdul Sadar RMAF. President Duterte, on his earlier part of presidency, postponed the visiting force agreement with the US. However, last year, it was reinstated. My question is, what might be the impact of the VFA towards ASEAN regional security? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think the question is the visiting forces agreement of the U.S. I think he's alluding to the Philippines. Yes, we have a visiting forces agreement with the United States since 1998, and this is the framework or the authority for us, the two countries, to conduct exercises in the Philippines and also in the U.S., but more often it is in the Philippines. Now the question is, does it contribute to regional security? Yes, I believe so, because it forges it strengthens military alliance in the region. The United States has defense agreement with Korea, Japan. It has also a little, I think it also with Taiwan and the Philippines down to Australia. And this is this arrangement actually is stabilizing that region. So the Americans, as you all know, has been in the Pacific in that area since at the turn of the 20th century in 1998, and they were in the Philippines for many years until we got our independence in 1944. But they retained two bases in the Philippines until 1992. They left their bases there, and after that we had this visiting forces agreement. And it also improves the relationship, the interoperability of both countries so that they can operate together. So all in all, I believe, we in the Philippines believe that the VFA is good for the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Delfin, do we have more questions from the floor? Yes, please.
A very good morning to the speakers and also the moderator. So, Mrs. Cynthia, I have two questions that I want to pose. The first one is to His Excellency Secretary Delfin. As we know that Southeast Asian region, located in a very spatial shared Southeast Asia and South China Sea, as this issue has started to take rise in the international relations and diplomacy, plus different ASEAN member states have different stance and understanding on this issue. Thus, how can ASEAN ensure that peaceful coexistence can be nurtured and maintained in far future? Because I'm from the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia. So as we know that peaceful coexistence has become one of the main thrusts in our Malaysian foreign policy and focus and continuity. So the question is on the peaceful coexistence. The second question is I want to pose to His Excellency Dr. Ng on terrorism. As I listened just now, and if I may quote, that terrorist groups still active despite travel and movement restrictions. So my question, with diverse system of belief, religion and understanding, and what the definition of terror is, how ASEAN member states anticipate to address terrorism issue in the region through collaborative efforts? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll go to Minister. Let's take the terrorism question first, because I think earlier you did mention that with travel restrictions removed, we will likely see increased terrorism activities. And in relation to his question, maybe you can take that first.
We're likely to see increased terrorism activity in our region. I mean, let's start there. And this is borne out by all our intelligence agencies. They were watching the chatter or listening to chatter. That's one. There were restrictions, and COVID affected everybody indiscriminately, as Hishammuddin rightly pointed out. And also there's a second reason. With the US drawdown of troops in the Middle East, the center of gravity will shift here. People who went to the Middle East, who either fought for Al-Qaeda or ISIS, are now returned. And when they return, they come with the networks, they come with their know-how. Our only really viable tool against terrorism is intelligence. The famous saying, we meaning the security agencies, have to succeed all the time. They only have to succeed once. And the only way, and when 9/11 occurred, the first response was as a failure in intelligence. And there's some truth in it. And so our focus should be on combined intelligence, which is why we supported the Indonesian idea of ASEAN intelligence collection. We are assisting Indonesia with our counterterrorism information facility, which we set up in Singapore, which has got liaison officers from Malaysia, from Philippines, from Indonesia, from the other ASEAN countries, that sit together with our PLUS partners, and then every week or month we sent out products on terrorist activities. And that has to be ramped up, because I think the Americans will lose some attention in the Middle East, Australians too, and they have very good intelligence agencies.
Thank you, Minister. The first question earlier, I think we may have broached the subject a little bit in our first question about having that peaceful coexistence and cooperation. I think if I can encapsulate your question, sir, is that the worry, as ASEAN so often does, is being caught in the middle of an escalating conflict in our very own backyard. Of course, we have seen increased assertiveness when it comes to some major powers. How to engage with these major powers and to convince them that ASEAN's centrality and sovereignty is of their best interest? If I may rephrase that question and add on to that. Dato Sri is looking at Secretary Delfin.
What was the question again? How can we convince the superpowers that...
Okay, all right. So, yeah, we don't want to get caught in between. But the reality is that there is increasing rivalry.
Yeah. It is actually very slippery slope to navigate. Yeah, there are two superpowers with varying interests in the region. Let's name it the China and the United States, and we have very good relationship with the United States. We have the mutual defense treaty with the U.S., but we also have a vast array of relationship with China. I think China now is our biggest trading partner. It used to be just a little bit Used to be that the U.S. is the biggest trading partner. Not anymore. It's with the Chinese, and we are actually dealing with them individually, talking to the Chinese, talking to the Americans. The problem in the South China Sea, as I said a while ago, is not the only thing that you know dominates our relationship with China. Now, if we have been many years ago, President Duterte went to China and I said, let's not talk about this South China Sea, talk about other things, trade, investment, and all those. But slowly we are talking on the side about how to deal with the conflicting claims in the South China Sea, or as we call it in the Philippines, the West Philippine Sea. There were proposals for a joint exploration of gas and oil in the area. And I think as I speak now, they're also negotiating on how to proceed because of the issue of sovereignty is always in the middle. But as far as the Philippines is concerned, we are there, we're smack in the center of the conflicted area. And I believe that we are doing our best, we are doing well in navigating our relationship with the U.S. and the Chinese.
3 points. First, our own gathering today at the ASEAN Defense Fraternity. We have the ADMM Plus mechanism, which involves engagement with nearly all the powers that may impact us. That structure and the ability to engage them is there if we want to use it. Secondly, bilaterally, for whatever reason, economic, security, historical, cultural, each of our 10 nations in ASEAN will have their own linkage with these superpowers. And if that advantage can be leveraged by the other countries which do not, it will be a way to manage the superpowers using our strength that exists in individual states in ASEAN. For example, Philippines' historical, cultural link up with the West, with the US, for example. Singapore has many friends. Malaysia has many friends. Now, if we look at this strength as not only individual strengths of members of ASEAN, but we are able to share that, to leverage and to make sure that with the premise of stability for our countries in this region, I think that's important. Secondly is intelligence, mentioned by Dr. Ng. It's not an easy matter, gathering information. Now, before we even get sensitive information, security information from outside ASEAN, we have to get our house in order first. Even in Malaysia, we have, military has got its military intelligence. Hamzah upstairs, who's doing a forum for himself, has got the special branch. Then the PM has got the external intelligence under research. How to coordinate all this from within our own national boundaries is an effort. So sometimes the public and the toxicity that comes with social media, they think it's so easy to ensure that they and their families are safe whilst bashing the defense ministers from their couch and from their rooms, comfort of their rooms. This is real. And most of the sideline bilateral meetings that we have had, these are the things that we do not share with the public. These are the things that we do as a matter of responsibility that comes with our job. We do naturally to ensure that all of you are safe. All our peoples in Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore are safe. And we don't expect any credit from that. And we won't, because it is not something that we would like to share. The fourth point is that when we have our act together at home, within the 10 countries, then let's see those that we have even bigger intelligence agencies in the States, in Russia, in China, and to share and look at this information and compare them. Because, of course, sometimes the information that gets to us is far too much and may be tainted or slanted to other agenda. But we cannot know what is that slant if we ourselves do not have the proper mechanism to know what the intelligence is, what is good for us as a nation, us as a group of 10 countries in ASEAN, and then actually chart the way forward. So the structure is there, the leverage is there, the intelligence information will have to be coordinated at all levels. But the most important thing for us to decide, really at the end of the day, is what is the threat that we are supposed to be facing as nations, as a region, because there will be information overload. Crisis that exists outside the world, I see, with bigger intelligence agencies, with bigger militaries, with bigger economic might. Sometimes, or most of the time, they get it wrong.
Thank you, Dato Sri. Hisham, do we have more questions?
Just
yes, please, Minister.
short answer. Ms. Cynthia Ng paraphrased the question: how do you avoid this region being caught up in geopolitical rivalry? And I would answer a little bit more circumspect, with great difficulty and hope. I still believe that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And in our histories, in our collective histories, we failed before. You look at ASEAN, almost all of us were ex-colonies. That was a manifestation of great power rivalry. Did we manage to prevent it? No. Whether it was the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Brits. You go before that, a clash between religions, right? Sri Majapahit, Vijaya. It's with hope that we think that it won't happen to this region again. And when ASEAN may not have coined the term, but popularized it in the UN, called proxy states and proxy wars. We were a region for proxy wars. What gives us the confidence that it won't happen again? I hope that collectively ASEAN says never again. Our never again moment, just like Europe did after 2 world wars, never again. And that should drive us to gain credibility, to gain centrality. And I think the final answer is that if you want to avoid, I don't think you can avoid all of the rivalry, but you do want to avoid being the intensity of it. And if the great powers see utility in ASEAN, and that it's more useful to me if it's left alone, it makes its own decisions, then I think we have a better chance of succeeding.
Thank you, Minister. We have about 5 minutes left. Do we have more questions from the floor? Yes, please, sir. Great. We have 2 more questions. So, sir, can we start with you and then to the gentleman in the middle?
Thank you, Moderator. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, sir. Bridget Nazwa, Royal Malaysian Air Force, currently with National Resident College, Post Pahanas. Quad was coined in 2017, which was fully supported by ASEAN countries that fostered global trading. AUKUS, however, was coined in November last year. My question, can the speakers share ASEAN stand and thoughts towards AUKUS? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So AUKUS, I believe from the ASEAN point of view, there has been a little bit of hesitancy about AUKUS and the fear that it might lead to arms race in our region. I'm just going to throw this question to Dato Sri Hisham to take it, and we'll follow up with Minister and
You heard us talking because Ng refused to answer the question because he's tired of answering AUKUS. And he just refused. So I'm stuck with it. Tak cia tau, datang daripada kita. AUKUS, we were quite frantic at the beginning. And our bilaterals, and I speak for Malaysia, with Australia at that time was, now, close enough for them to actually come and explain AUKUS with us. As it stands right now, it will take some time before these submarines come into production. It will take some time for us to see whether it's true that they will not be armed with nuclear capability. But Australia and the UK, both their ministers were in Kuala Lumpur to explain their decision. That's one. Secondly, which is more related to the booths that we have in the 3 floors of DSA and NASDAQ, how policy decisions could derail business contractual agreements that have been set. What I mean specifically is what Australia had with France, and for whatever considerations they had, commercial considerations were put aside based on higher considerations. Now, this is something that every business will have to take into account. So I believe this Putrajaya Forum is not just about security-linked personnel. We have businesses out there who will have to look into what has happened in AUKUS very seriously. So the answer, geopolitically, security, as far as Malaysia is concerned, we have been given certain assurances of the parties concerned. We need to monitor that very closely. But one that people have not really looked into as far as AUKUS is concerned is the impact and the ability for business to business, especially in defense industry, to chart the way forward. Because these are assets that takes years to build. It involves huge sums of money. And if it can happen in this case, the damage to the integrity of what is discussed down there in the halls and have to be decided by governments involves all the defense ministers as it arises. AUKUS is just one. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia is another. I think Malaysia, I won't speak for the others in ASEAN, but we have Russian assets in our Air Force. We have Russian arsenal that is in the past in our military capability. Now, how does the sanctions and what is unfolding in Ukraine affect our ability to protect our nation based on other assets? So one way out of this is for ASEAN to get our act together, to be less dependent on these superpowers, and be sure that at the end of the day, the basic requirement and obligation as defense ministers, as chief of defense forces, as chief of the Navy, Air Force, who are all here today, is really to look at the capacity of us moving forward alone first, then regionally, and then only, if there's no other option, rely on countries which in the past have not really been consistent in delivering what they have promised.
Thank you, Dr. Sri. We are running out of time, but because I promised that gentleman in the blue mask for a final question, so let's take that one and then we will go for a break.
Good afternoon, chairs, and Her Excellency itself. So, I would like to talk about Dr. Ng did mention upon about ASEAN collective approach, the collective corporations. So we are seeing that ASEAN is like a brother itself, that we help each others, and we basically strengthen our bonds by adjourning engagement, annual engagement in security, and exercises in sort of stuff for prevent ourselves from the accident threats. So the main question is, upon Dr. Street question itself, are we ready for the cybersecurity threat itself? Is it ASEAN collective approach still plausible in this matter itself, in sense of cybersecurity? Thank you very much.
The questions on cybersecurity.
Yeah, cybersecurity is now turning to be a very big problem for everybody. And unfortunately, the Philippines is playing catch up on this field. We are just now developing our cybersecurity infrastructure. And in fact, we have sent some people to Singapore before, a couple of years back, to learn how they put up their infrastructure to safeguard their banks and all those entities there from being attacked, from being subjected to cyber attack. And yes, we are going to invest more on this field, and we recognize the gravity of this threat to our security. Thank you.
Since this is the last question, I might as well say my 5 cents worth. How do I phrase this? I see cyber security in 2 dimensions. One is to protect whatever we have and have mechanisms to hang on to it as much as possible. The other cyber element is to have mechanisms to see what is out there to protect us from threats coming in. I've been exposed to all the cyber, not all, but most of the cyber capabilities of huge nations and who have invested billions into that structure, manpower. But my question arises is that with that capacity, were they able to predict and foresee what unfolded in Afghanistan when Taliban came in a space of about a week? So these are questions that we have to think about in Malaysia on the investments of cyber security to predict the threats that come in. And that is unfolding. And related to that, we have not actually studied the risk on cyber information out there in the cloud due to COVID. I alluded to that in my speech with regards to all the applications to deal with the health threats of COVID, but that information now is in the public domain. And you know, in the past, we want to monitor the movements of terrorists in whatever capacity. We want to know their identity. We want to know their health conditions in dealing with them. But now the information of basic individual Malaysians are out there, and that's happened in the last 2 years due to COVID. I need to be assured that that information does not get into the hands of our enemies in dealing with the security elements, cyber. Yeah? At the moment, as we speak, there is a forum on cyber security done by the Interior Minister, Hamzah. We'll be seeing what the outcome of that discussions, but that is in the portfolio of our interior security element. To protect ourselves, the first element, to protect ourselves on cyber attacks. This is ongoing, and I believe that the military intelligence have got its own capacity, the special branch has got its own ways of doing it. The three of us talk about it and have mechanisms to find the best way to protect our systems. And rest assured, whatever it takes to protect a system that we already have, whether it's good enough to predict what are the threats that are coming in, I'm not so sure. But since we already have those systems, we must make sure that these systems that we have has enough mechanism so that it will not be open and vulnerable to attacks from the outside.
Thank you so much, Dato Sri. I think that wraps up our session for today, as you have already mentioned, balancing traditional and non-traditional threats that may not have appeared, that we can't see. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave you with that. We will go for a break now. Once again, thank you so much, Secretary Delfin, Dato Sri Hisham, and Honorable Minister, for sharing your thoughts, insights with us. And thank you so much for participating. I hope you have a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please give a big round of applause again to our moderators and speakers. Thank you. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our session will adjourn for a lunch break. Lunch is served in Hall 11 on this floor, and our second session will continue at 13:50. I repeat, our second session will repeat at 13:50. Enjoy your Malaysian cuisine. See you again shortly. Thank you.